They found the ink still wet on the final page when they forced the door at dawn, the quill left standing in the well like a black sapling in a pool of frozen blood, and though the hearth had been cold for 3 nights, the woman's hand lay across the paper as if it had just paused to listen, the flesh already the color of old parchment, yet uncannily pliant, so that the constable, who had broken bread with her the previous winter and thought himself acquainted with the limits of dread, felt his knees loosen when the fingers curled slightly under his own, as though the nerves inside remembered a duty that outlasted the blood. The room smelled of smoke that had never been allowed to burn, of wool soaked in lye and left to dry without rinsing, of the sweet fatty odor that rises when a candle is snuffed too close to tallow that has already begun to turn. But beneath these was something sharper, a metallic green scent like bruised hemlock after rain, and it clung to the back of the tongue long after the men had carried her out and nailed the shutters closed. No one had heard her speak since the first snow, yet the neighbors swore they had caught fragments of a low, even voice through the chinks at impossible hours, reciting what sounded like scripture run backward, the syllables crawling over one another like grubs in a fallen apple. And more than once a child had been startled from sleep by a phrase that seemed to enter through the ear and keep traveling inward until it lodged behind the eyes, repeating itself in the dark of the skull for days. The constable's wife, a woman who prided herself on sensible grief, tore the page from the corpse's grasp and read it aloud to the gathered men before her husband could stay her tongue. She managed 6 words. We welcomed it by refusing, before her voice coarsened into a cough that brought blood bright as currant jelly onto the whitewashed wall, and she would speak no more in daylight thereafter, though at night she was heard conversing with the rafters in a dialect no minister recognized. That was the first intimation that the widow's death had been only a punctuation, a comma inserted by a hand that preferred sentences to run for decades, and that the story, which began in the winter of 1757, had not yet reached its verb. The settlement, if the scatter of farms along the upper Lamoille could be called such, had no name on the provincial maps, only a charcoal smudge where the surveyor's horse had refused to cross the river twice and had been turned back toward the Champlain lowlands. The people who lived there spoke of it simply as the corner, a phrase that sounded casual in daylight, but after twilight carried the hush of a thing that knows itself to be watched. The widow, Deliverance Hull, had come 15 years earlier with a husband who cleared 10 acres of beech and yellow birch before his cough reduced him to skin and expectation, and who was finally laid beneath a cairn of those same stones he had dragged from the field he would never plant. She stayed on with 3 sons who grew tall and taciturn as the white pines, and with a daughter whose eyes were the precise gray of river ice just before it bears weight. Their cabin squatted on a shelf of land above the gorge, half buried in the hillside as if the mountain had tried to shrug it off and then thought better, and the path to it climbed through a stand of hemlock so dense that noon smelled of midnight. Travelers complained of a pressure behind the forehead beginning half a mile downstream, a sensation like the approach of weather that refused to break. Deliverance kept the Bible open on a deal table that never quite sat level. The pages turned to the same chapter of Nehemiah month after month, they which build on the wall, and they that bear burdens, with those that laded, every one with one of his hands wrought in the work, and with the other hand held a weapon, though she could not read more than a few syllables, without her lips moving as though negotiating with an older tongue. When the preacher from the river parish rode up in 1755 to invite her to meeting, he left his horse at the foot of the incline and walked the rest on foot because the animal rolled its eyes and would not cross the invisible line where the moss grew black. He found her boiling linen in a kettle whose copper had turned the color of dried heart blood, and she greeted him without surprise, as if she had been expecting his visit since before her own birth, and she listened to his exhortation with the polite stillness of a child who has already decided never to obey. The doctrine she lived by, if doctrine it was, had arrived in the valley not as sermon but as rumor, carried by the same fur traders who brought smallpox and cheap rum, a story that certain elders in the hill towns of Massachusetts had begun to teach that damnation was not a future condition, but a present and abiding residence, that the soul was already ruined, and all piety merely a courteous rearrangement of the furniture in a burning house. One trader, half delirious with fever, had babbled of a woman in the Berkshires who kept a sealed jar beside her bed, and told her children it contained the sound of their infant cries that she had saved for the day they would deny her, and that on that day she would open the lid, and the noise would call home whatever mercy they had scattered. He died before sunrise, but the jar, whether real or imagined, took root in the imagination of the valley like a seed that needs only darkness. Deliverance asked no questions when the story reached her, yet the next spring she nailed a small cedar box to the western wall of her cabin, just above the height a child could reach, and she forbade her sons to touch it on pain of whatever loss they had not yet learned to fear. When the youngest, whose name was Silas, asked what the box contained, she studied him as though trying to remember which of his features she had borrowed from memory, and replied only that it held the portion of their future they could not be trusted with yet, and that patience was the name of the lock. After that, the boys sometimes woke to find her standing over their pallets in the moonlight, her arms hanging at her sides like empty sleeves, and though she never spoke, they carried into mourning the certainty that she had been listening to something inside them that they themselves had not yet been told. The first public sign that the widow's private reckoning had overflowed its banks came in the autumn of 1756, when the corn stood tall enough to hide a man on horseback, and the river ran so low that the bones of last year's drowned cattle showed through the water like the ribs of a half-built ship. A girl named Remember Adams, 10 years old and fond of wandering, left her father's milking at dusk to gather beechnuts on the slope above the Hull cabin. She was seen by 2 witnesses, her elder brother and a passing tinker, standing at the edge of the gorge with her pinafore full, looking down into the shadows as if someone below had called her by a name she had not yet been given. When she did not return by moonrise, the men of the corner formed their line abreast and walked the fields with pine knots, shouting themselves hoarse against the drone of crickets that seemed to mock the cadence of their panic. They found the first clue at the foot of a hemlock, whose roots clutched the bank like the fingers of a hand that had changed its mind too late. A circle of beechnuts arranged with the precision of a communion rail, each shell split open and empty, the kernels gone as though extracted by a tongue that preferred to taste without being observed. Beyond that circle, the vegetation had been pressed flat in the shape of a small body, but the earth was dry and gave no footprint, and the only sound was the river muttering over stones it had already worn to anonymity. The mother, half mad with the simplicity of grief, demanded to know why deliverance had not joined the search. When the widow appeared at the edge of the torchlight, she carried in her apron a quantity of pale shards that might have been broken crockery, or might have been finger bones emptied of their marrow, and she offered them without explanation, saying only that the girl had finished what she came to do and that the valley would keep her voice for later use. The constable, a man named Josiah Slay, who had once studied for the ministry before the death of his infant daughter, scraped the belief out of him like the flesh of a winter squash, felt the first tug of what he would come to call the long attention, a sensation that something in the landscape had begun to take notes. He ordered the search party to fan outward along the river, but he himself climbed the slope toward the Hull cabin, drawn by a suspicion that whatever had happened to Remember Adams had already been filed away in the cedar box nailed high on the western wall. The door stood open as it always did in fair weather, and the hearth gave off a heat that smelled of burnt hair and green hemlock, a combination that tightened the skin across his cheekbones. On the table lay a single sheet of paper covered with marks that were not writing, but resembled the tracks of birds that had walked across the ink while it was still wet. And beside it a bowl of milk in which floated 3 dark seeds, shaped exactly like human eyes, narrowed in amusement. He did not touch them, but he noted that the milk had not yet curdled, though the night was warm, and that the bowl was carved from a single knot of pine, the grain circling the rim like the growth rings of a tree that had learned to count in reverse. He pushed past her without answering, but the next morning he discovered that his horse had gone blind in the left eye, and that the leather of his saddle had cracked along the seam, as though something inside had tried to breathe. The valley measured time thereafter, not by Sundays or by the slow turn of constellations, but by the disappearance of children, one each month, always at the thinning of the moon when the night sky resembled a slate wiped clean by a cautious hand. The second to vanish was a boy whose father had whipped him for speaking to the widow's daughter at the mill race. The third was the tinker's granddaughter who had sung a rhyme about a woman with a box of eyes. The fourth was the preacher's own son, a child so pious he blushed when the wind lifted his coatum. After each loss, the circle of empty shells was found somewhere near the gorge, arranged with the same devotional precision, and after each circle deliverance appeared at the mourner's doors, with her apron full of anonymous shards, offering them in silence until someone took them from her, and then retreating as though the transaction had completed a circuit that required no further comment. The mothers began to dream of a room whose walls were papered with the missing faces, the eyes following every movement but never blinking. The fathers drank themselves into stupors that ended with them clawing at their own ears, as if to excavate a voice that had crawled inside and would not cease its patient recitation. Josiah Slay kept his notes in a ledger whose margins he had ruled into small squares, one for each day that passed without incident, but the squares began to fill with a symbol he did not remember drawing, a circle bisected by a vertical line, the upper half shaded, the lower left blank, and he woke one dawn to find the symbol cut into the flesh of his forearm with what must have been a very hot blade because the edges were cauterized and gave off the sweet odor of pork just beginning to scorch. By the spring of 1757, the valley had exhausted its capacity for public grief and had begun to cultivate the more economical crop of private suspicion. Families moved their beds closer to the hearth and spoke in whispers, even when alone, convinced that the widow's listening had grown porous enough to enter through the chinks. Deliverance herself had begun to age at a speed visible to the eye, her hair whitening as though the nights were bleaching it from within, her spine folding forward like a book pressed shut by a careless reader. Yet the daughter, Catherine, remained unchanged, her skin retaining the translucent sheen of early adolescence, despite the fact that she had passed 20 winters. Catherine was seen more often beyond the cabin now, walking the river at dusk with a stride that matched the current so perfectly she seemed to remain stationary while the landscape flowed past. She carried no light, but the water around her feet glimmered with a phosphorescence that might have been decaying vegetation or might have been the reflection of something luminous beneath her skirt. On the first night of April, she appeared at the Slay farmhouse and asked to borrow a cup of salt, speaking in a voice so like her mother's that Josiah's wife dropped the ladle and did not retrieve it. When she returned the salt the next evening, the cup was empty, but the rim was crusted with a red deposit that tasted of iron and cedar. And the following morning the constable found his ledger altered so that every square now contained the bisected circle, the ink still wet, though he had locked the book in a drawer whose key he wore on a thong around his neck. The descent, when it arrived, wore the mask of ordinary calamity. A late frost killed the winter wheat, the river flooded and carried away 3 sows and a yoke of oxen. The millstones cracked so that the flour came out speckled with what looked like ground bone. Yet each disaster carried the aftertaste of having been invited, as though the valley had spoken a wish aloud and then forgotten the language required to retract it. Deliverance no longer left her cabin by day. Instead, she sat at the window facing the gorge, her lips moving in a rhythm that matched the pulse visible in the throat of anyone who watched her too long. The cedar box had begun to emit a sound too soft to be called knocking, more like the memory of a heartbeat just before sleep, and the sons, who had grown into men of few words and fewer questions, took to sleeping in the barn with their rifles loaded but never fired, though they could not say what target they expected to rise out of the dark. One of them, the eldest named Obadiah, was found one morning hanging by his heels from the hayloft beam, his throat cut so neatly that the head had rotated a full quarter turn, and regarded the world upside down with an expression of mild surprise. The blood had been collected in a wooden trencher placed beneath him, and though the quantity was great, it had not spilled, as though the vessel had been measured against the supply and found exact. Deliverance stood over him while the others cut him down, and she touched the wound with the tip of her finger, then placed the finger in her mouth, nodding as if the taste confirmed a ledger entry long disputed. After the funeral, which was attended only by the immediate family and by Josiah Slay, who came to see whether the earth would accept a body without argument, Deliverance began to write, covering sheets of paper that she nailed to the walls with shingle nails, the pages overlapping like scales until the interior of the cabin resembled the shed skin of some translucent reptile. The writing was not English, nor any tongue known to the few who still dared to look, but it possessed the irregular rhythm of breath caught at the moment of conversion from air to something thicker. Catherine copied the symbols into a smaller book, whose pages were made of cloth, and she stitched the sheets together with hair taken from the brush of Remember Adams, the color still bright as if the child continued to grow in the dark. The constable, driven by a curiosity that felt indistinguishable from nausea, climbed the slope one final time and peered through a gap in the shutters. He saw the widow dip her quill into the bowl of milk, now permanently red, and draw a line across the paper that continued onto the table and then onto the floor, where it joined a network of similar lines that converged beneath the cedar box, pulsing faintly like veins learning to walk. He understood then that the house itself had become a page, and that the story being written was not about the valley, but by it, a collaboration between the woman and the land that required the ink of what refused to be forgotten. The horror, when it ripened, did not arrive as spectacle, but as distribution. The pages began to disappear, 1 or 2 each night, torn away so neatly that the nails remained in the walls like tiny iron flowers left after the petals have walked home. They were found later in places where the missing children had last been seen, folded into the hollow of a tree, tucked beneath a stone at the river's edge, rolled into the mouth of a bird that had been dead long enough to dry, but not long enough to forgive. Whoever found them carried away a stain on the palm that could not be washed out, a faint brown shadow that spread slowly until it resembled the map of a valley no one could identify. And within days the bearer began to speak, in a voice not their own, recounting details of childhoods they had never lived, describing the taste of beechnut meat mixed with something metallic, repeating the phrase, "We welcomed it by refusing until the listener fled or fell silent." Josiah Slay, whose shadow had begun to precede him by several inches, as though the light had grown weary of his shape, gathered the pages he could recover and locked them in the meeting house. But the next morning, the building stood open, and the pulpit had been moved to the center of the floor. The Bible placed atop it, open to the same chapter of Nehemiah, the margins filled with the same bird track symbols, the paper damp as if freshly licked. By midsummer, the valley had begun to dream awake. Plows split rocks that bled a clear fluid that smelled of rainwater held too long in a graveyard vase. Cows gave milk that would not churn, but separated into a red curd and a whey that tasted of tears. Children born in June emerged with the cords wrapped 3 times around their necks like necklaces they had already outgrown. Deliverance no longer wrote. Instead, she sat beside the cedar box and listened, her head tilted at the angle of someone recognizing a tune heard in infancy and only now remembered. Catherine had begun to sing, a melody without words that wandered the cabin like a blindfolded guest, and when the song reached certain notes, the box answered with a vibration that loosened the nails in the walls so that the paper scales rustled like feathers preparing for flight. On the night of the summer solstice, the constable, driven by a dream in which his own dead daughter led him by the hand up the slope, returned to find the cabin door torn off its leather hinges and lying some distance away, the surface scorched with handprints that faced both inward and outward, as though the wood had tried to claw itself free in both directions at once. Inside, the pages had been stripped clean, the walls bare and glistening as if newly skinned. The cedar box stood open, its interior lined with a membrane that pulsed faintly, the color of river ice seen from below. Deliverance lay on the floor, her body arranged so that her open mouth aligned with the mouth of the box, and though her eyes were closed, they appeared to follow the constable as he circled, the pupils sliding beneath the lids like fish refusing the net. He carried her down the slope in his arms, surprised at how little she weighed, as though the words she had consumed had been the only ballast keeping her on the earth. The valley watched without protest, the crickets quiet, the river holding its breath. They buried her in the corner of the field where her husband lay, the stones piled higher this time, because the men feared what might walk out if the soil were left unsecured, and the preacher attempted a service but found his throat filled with the taste of beechnut and iron, so that the prayers emerged as whimpers no congregation could follow. The cedar box was left behind in the cabin, which was burned the same afternoon, the flames green at the base and orange at the crown, the smoke rising in a column that did not bend with the wind, but stood straight as a monument until nightfall, when it collapsed inward and left only a square of ash that refused to scatter. For a week afterward, the valley tasted of smoke that had never been allowed to burn, and the constable woke each morning with the symbol cut fresh into his skin, the lines deeper, the cauterization neater, until on the 7th day the wound did not close but remained open, revealing a darkness that appeared to extend far below the level of bone, as though the body had begun to draft its own absence. The ending, if it can be called such, arrived with the first frost of October, when the grass whitened overnight and the river carried on its surface a thin film that reflected the sky without revealing the water beneath. Catherine walked down the slope at dawn, her feet bare, her hair unbound, carrying the cloth book sewn with the dead child's hair. She moved through the settlement without haste, pausing at each threshold to tear out a page and press it into the crack beneath the door, the paper vanishing as if the wood inhaled it. No one tried to stop her, though every rifle was loaded and every heart contained a prayer that felt like a stone in the throat. She completed her circuit and continued north, following the river until the trees closed behind her, and the sound of her steps was replaced by the murmur of water over stones that had begun to shape themselves into small white faces, the features soft but recognizable to anyone who had lost a child in the preceding year. The constable, whose wound had widened until the arm below it appeared translucent, followed at a distance that increased no matter how slowly he walked. When he reached the place where she had last been seen, he found only the cloth book lying open to a final page on which had been drawn a single circle, perfectly blank, the center pierced by a hole that extended down through the paper and into the earth beneath, so deep that when he knelt and listened, he could hear, rising from far below, the sound of children laughing in a room whose walls were papered with the faces of adults who had forgotten how to cry out. He covered the hole with a stone, but the next morning the stone had split along its grain, and the two halves lay apart like lips preparing to speak. And though he returned every day for the remainder of his life, the circle remained open, the laughter growing softer, more practiced, as though the voices were learning to pronounce the name of the valley in a language that had only ever contained one word, and that word was already inside everyone who had ever listened for it, waiting for the moment when the page would be turned and the story, at last, would begin to read them. The first snow of the season arrived the night Catherine vanished, not as a fall but as a settling, the flakes hovering in the air longer than gravity allowed, as though the sky were reluctant to commit its evidence to the ground. By morning the valley lay beneath a blanket so thin that every contour of the underlying earth remained visible, like a corpse whose shroud has been woven of spun glass. Josiah Slay stood at the lip of the circle cut into the paper and the soil, watching the white accumulate along the rim without obscuring it, and he understood that the season itself had become a continuation of the sentence Deliverance had begun writing the previous winter, a clause that required the participation of every living thing that remained. He tried to speak the blankness aloud, but his breath congealed into a shape that resembled the bisected circle, hanging crystalline before his face until it shattered, and the fragments entered his mouth like communion that had been blessed in reverse. Behind him, the settlement stirred with the slow reluctance of survivors who have begun to suspect that survival is only a different genre of haunting. Doors opened onto doorways that now contained an extra dimension of shadow, and the smoke rising from chimneys bent horizontally at the height of a child's shoulder, as though the air itself had learned to refuse ascension. By noon, the men gathered in the meeting house, not for worship, but for accounting, and they found that the ledger Josiah had locked away now lay open on the pulpit, its pages filled with a single line, repeated until the ink had worn through the paper. We welcomed it by refusing. They counted the remaining children, 9 in all, and discovered that each bore on the inside of the lower lip a mark shaped like the missing circle, a pale ring that did not bleed when pricked, but emitted a faint odor of beechnut and iron, the taste of a story that had already been swallowed and could not be brought back up without bringing the stomach with it. That winter the valley ate itself in increments too small to be called sacrifice. A kettle left on the fire overnight showed in the morning a rim of metal eaten away as though by acid. A loaf of bread set to cool was found hollowed to a shell that crumbled at the touch, revealing inside a single human tooth wrapped in a strand of gray hair. The river froze, not smooth, but ridged with the impressions of small hands pressed upward from beneath, and when the men cut through for water, they heard beneath the ice a knocking that matched the rhythm of their own heartbeats, delayed by half a second, so that each man felt his pulse arrive from somewhere outside his body. Josiah's wound had expanded until the arm below it no longer cast a shadow, the flesh having achieved a translucency that revealed the bones as pale reeds in a pond that had forgotten the sky. He tied a black ribbon above the elbow to warn the others, but the ribbon frayed overnight into fibers that spelled in microscopic script the names of every child who had vanished, the letters too small to read, yet legible to the fingertips when the cloth was handled in the dark. On the night of the winter solstice, the remaining children were locked in the meeting house for safekeeping, the windows shuttered, the hearth heaped with coals that glowed the color of a wound kept open for observation. The parents stood guard in rotating pairs, though they found themselves unable to look directly at one another, their gazes sliding away as if repelled by an identical recognition. At midnight, the fire collapsed inward without warning, the coals arranging themselves into a perfect circle bisected by a vertical line, the room filled with the smell of beechnuts roasting, and when the guards rushed inside, they found the children standing in the same configuration, their eyes open, their mouths shaping the circle of a scream that produced no sound, the silence so complete that it seemed to inhale the very memory of noise. When the thaw arrived, it did so as a hesitation, the ice retreating inch by inch as though the river were reconsidering its commitment to motion. The first boat to attempt the crossing lodged midstream on an obstruction that proved to be the cedar box, its wood now waterlogged and split, the interior membrane swollen into a bulb that pulsed faintly when exposed to air. They hauled it ashore with ropes, but the instant it touched dry land, the membrane ruptured, releasing a spill of paper scraps that unfolded themselves and revealed each to bear the face of one of the missing children, the ink still wet enough to smear under the thumb, the expressions composed in an attitude of listening so intense that the viewer felt the ear itself become a wound. Josiah, whose arm now ended at the elbow in a cauterized bloom that gave off the sweet odor of perpetual scorch, collected the scraps and carried them to the field where deliverance lay. He dug a hole at the foot of her cairn and buried them. But the next morning the stones had been rearranged into the shape of an open mouth, the scraps gone, the earth within the hole packed smooth as if a tongue had pressed it flat against the roof of a pallet. That afternoon the first of the remaining children sickened, a fever that burned so cold the skin turned the blue of river ice seen from below. The child spoke in a voice that belonged to no one present, describing a room whose walls were papered with the faces of adults who had forgotten how to cry out. And when the fever broke, the child's eyes remained the color of wet ash, the pupils fixed in the shape of the bisected circle. One by one the others followed, each fever arriving with the precision of a punctuation mark inserted into a sentence that had been spoken aloud for centuries and only now transcribed. And when the last child rose from the sickbed, the valley itself seemed to exhale, the river resuming its flow, the buds on the trees unfurling with the slow reluctance of eyelids that have learned to refuse the morning. The final accounting took place on the first day of May, when the men met in the field where the cabin had burned and found that the ash square had not dispersed but had compacted into a slab the color of bone emptied of marrow. Etched into its surface were the symbols deliverance had written, the lines now raised like scars that had decided to remember the shape of the blade. They tried to break it apart with picks, but the iron bounced back as if striking something denser than stone, and when they lifted it, they discovered beneath a second slab, and beneath that a third, the stack descending farther than the longest arm could reach, each layer bearing the same inscription in progressively smaller script, until the eye lost the ability to distinguish letter from absence. Josiah, whose wound had begun to emit a sound too soft to be called knocking, more like the memory of a heartbeat just before sleep, recognized that the valley had become a book whose pages turned downward rather than across, and that they stood at the topmost sentence of a volume that had no final chapter, only a margin that narrowed as it receded until it became the width of a throat, preparing to swallow its own echo. They covered the slab with earth and planted rye above it, but the grain emerged yellow and translucent, each stalk containing within its hollow core a filament, dark as ink that flexed when the wind passed over it, spelling in microscopic script the names of every adult who had watched a child disappear and had continued to draw breath thereafter. The harvest that autumn was gathered in silence, the rye ground into flour that refused to rise, the bread baked flat as pages pressed by a conscientious archivist. And when the settlers ate it, they tasted the identical flavor of beechnut and iron, the aftertaste of a story that had entered the mouth and would not leave until the mouth itself had become a chapter in a book that preferred to read itself aloud in the dark. Years later, when the valley had been abandoned and the forest had begun to reclaim the fields with saplings that grew in the shape of open hands, travelers reported finding along the old path a single stone that had been split along its grain, the halves lying apart like lips preparing to speak, and between them, preserved by no human agency, a scrap of paper bearing the final line of the widow's manuscript, the ink still wet enough to smear under the thumb. We welcomed it by refusing. No one who read the line aloud could remember the sound of their own voice afterward, and they carried away a stain on the palm that darkened slowly until it resembled the map of a valley no one could identify, the borders shifting each time the hand was examined, the center pierced by a hole that extended down through the flesh and into the earth beneath, so deep that when they knelt and listened, they could hear, rising from far below, the laughter of children learning to pronounce the name of the place they had never left, waiting for the moment when the page would be turned and the story, at last, would begin to read the reader.